Hey, my name is Dima Maurice Hanna, and I was asked to record this lecture for spatial design students in their spatial histories unit to introduce my sociospatial reading for refugee settlements, planned refugee settlements or refugee camps, which can also count as a brief overview to my PhD research for the past 3.5 years. Um, on few refugee camps in the Middle East. What this lecture wants to resist early on is allowing you to think that any knowledge you will gain about refugee settlements might allow you, future architect, to come up with the next refugee solution in a lab or a studio. Also, what it avoids is to put you in a place of authority as designers to save the vulnerable or establish world peace. So, what's this lecture about? Explore, interrogate instant settlements that host displaced communities suspended in the none place. Whole urban bodies that exist in between time and geography on the thresholds of the sovereignties of the states or host governments. Are we still talking about refugee architecture? Yes. Let's break it down. To better understand a term like refugee architecture, let's start defining some terms. Um, Whether it's the real definition or imposed definition, definitions are important. So, the subject of these settlements, the refugee, every 2 seconds, a person is forcibly displaced due to a conflict of persecution. In the world right now, there are 25.9 million refugees. 20.4 million of these are under the UN, the United Nations mandate. The term refugee is defined in Refugee Convention as people who can't go back out to their home or the country of their nationality uh, to fear or persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or the membership of a particular social group. The camp, refugees in great numbers, mass displacement, end up living in long-lasting islands of temporary dwellings, overseen by the humanitarian bodies and relief organizations that coordinate with host governments to host them on their land in a temporary way under the mandate of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. So, what do we know about refugee camps? Refugee camps, also known as planned humanitarian settlements, are designed by the humanitarian organizations as temporary, standardized infrastructures that respond to moments of political failure to contain mass displacement. So you would see standardized solutions, temporary solutions for shelter, such as this one that was in the shelter design catalog of the UNHCR. You would see it in Colombia, Bangladesh, Jordan, to host any community from anywhere on any geography. However, when I visited this particular camp, the Zatari camp, 3 years after that photo was taken, it looked something like this. This ephemeral solution fails the communities, the refugee communities, and it transforms to a state of permanent temporariness as refugees suffer from something called a protracted situation. Means that it's a very long stay and they have growing needs and they transform those temporary shelters to something else. They amend the built environment in order to deal with their needs. Eventually, that transforms the temporary simple camp into a complex urban body or a refugee settlement. What we know is that 78% of all refugees are in protracted situations. That means there is no way we can know when they're going back to their home countries. The UN says that the average of protraction is 17 years. However, World Bank reports say there is no way to calculate how long or the duration of the settlement in a refugee camp. We know that Palestinian refugees are in refugee camps for 70 years now. So there is a static, unchanging, and passive state of warehousing refugees in camps. Architecture. To understand the specialities of camp, from a refugee-centered perspective, I adopted a social understanding of architecture as a social product. And in particular, I adopted the Hiller and Hansen definition of architecture that draws a distinction between the building as surfaces and the volumes and the uses of the surfaces it hosts. Meaning, the order of those empty spaces within a building, that's what creates architecture into something called space syntax. To simplify this, and what I really mean by space syntax is that when you host a dinner and invite people to your house, you don't host them in the bathroom. There is a special order of spaces that accommodates your social needs. That's architecture. It's not the surfaces of the building. And the reason I chose this definition in particular is that we might get stuck at the surfaces because they look chaotic, they're added over time. It might look like a slum or informal design, but what really is, when you look at the spaces and their arrangement and the space syntax within those transformed shelters, you would find that there is a clear pattern that creates architecture in the most unusual of places. So when we look at the emergence of this new and unexplored architecture in refugee camps, is it a mess? Is it unidentified? My experience says that it's architecture. But before I take you to my journey in exploring humanitarian settlements, let's try and make sense of it by exploring how other theorists saw the camp and the shapes they drew for the camp and how they envisioned the camp. These are not real shapes, these are conceptual shapes that can communicate how people looked at this built environment in protraction. The early conception of refugee camps, we might think of it as a square, as something rigid, orthogonal, because the early construction of refugee camps, according to Malky, it was based on the military barracks. Because before refugees were under the UN mandate, they were under military as a combat problem under the military's jurisdiction. So military used to host refugees in military barracks that was temporary and orthogonal with utilities and services placed in the middle. However, in the post-World War II, 1951, it became under the UNHCR mandate. However, the UN kept that solution as temporary and as a military barrack, even though it doesn't fulfill the solution for the problem. So we can see on the left in Kenya and on the right, Zaatari camp in Jordan. It's exactly the same layout, it's orthogonal. This temporary solution fails. We can look at this refugee camp in Lebanon, and that was established in 1948 for Palestinian refugees. It looks like a mess. It failed. It didn't. It looks like building transgressions or spatial violations. However, it's the needs of the people that ended up overspilling and changing and transforming. Then comes Agamben, and he looked at the camp from a different perspective. He was like, the camp stays on the threshold of the state. It's not part of the state, of a government. It's on the thresholds of the politics and the law of the state's sovereignty. It's in a state of exception. And then comes Agir, and Agir conceptualized the camp differently. Like, the camp is managed and controlled by the humanitarian body, and it controls all refugees in a very novel sociospatial form. However, when the subject takes control, meaning when refugees start amending this built environment, it takes the form of a city camp. So the camp appears as suspended and a historical present of exile, according to Abu Rahmeh, and yet we don't know what the real shape of the camp. It still remains undefined in terms of architecture. What's the camp like? How does it look like? We don't know. It's shapeless. It stayed stuck in that conceptual theoretical realm, but in reality, it remains unexplored to architects. So what did I find out? When I went to those camps and I tried to explore the concept of refugee architecture, how did displaced communities inside those camps create and experience architecture? So my research focused on Jordan, and I chose 3 refugee camps, one in 1951, Jabal Hussein, the other was built in 1968. Yes, these are all temporary refugee camps. And the last one is Zaatari in 2012, and it's to host Syrian refugees. It's the biggest camp I've visited. It hosts 80,000. So Jabal Hussein camp, right now it's in the middle of the capital city in Jordan, Amman. But when it started, it was on the borders of the city. But over the years, the city grew, and now it became a pocket of the city. It hosts the Nakba Palestinian refugees. Jarash camp is north next to the famous Roman ruins in Jarash, and it's in a rural area, lots of farms around it. It's built in 1968, and it hosts around 30,000 Palestinian refugees of the Six-Day War. The last one, Zaatari, you would look at it, it's in the middle of the desert, very harsh, very controlled environment. And it hosts around 80,000 refugees. And you can see that it's split into many districts with thoroughfares in the middle. That's the growth of the camp in 3 years. The master plan looks something like this. So when I looked at the refugee architecture, my methodology was designed according to architecture phenomenology, and in very simple words, I was collecting observation based on my perceptions of the architecture space that I experienced on several levels. And the level number one is the domestic shelter, which I will focus on in this presentation, but I will introduce you to the other levels very briefly. So the domestic shelter is the smallest unit of the camp, and then how the shelter organization, how shelters relate to each other in clusters, and then the camp as one single urban entity. So refugee camps that started in the early 50s, it also started like camps, just like refugee camps start today. But after a while, the Palestinian refugees started um, splitting those single space tents using the blankets for more private arrangements. And then after that, they started to add boulder walls to surround their tents for protection from other people and the weather, made of stone and mud, which is a practice that Palestinians used in their fruit gardens in their homes. And then after a while, they started adding corrugated metal sheets as roofs called zinco. And the tent started to transform slowly into a more complex architecture. At that time, the UN had just started. They didn't know how to deal with it. So there were different attempts to maneuver this evolution and transformation of the camp. Sometimes they would give refugees grants or building materials or help build single space rooms. However, there was also this struggle with the refugees themselves because they wanted to go back, but they didn't. And right now we're in 2020 and refugees are still in those camps. So you can start seeing how the mess started to happen, the visual mess started to happen in the 1960s. And today, the oldest Palestinian camp I visited, shelters look like this. So when we look at the morphology of those tents to the current dwellings in each of these camps, I found out that there are elements or spaces that repeat and that form a pattern in the space, that form space syntax, which creates architecture. The definition we explored early on. So there were special components, special elements that kept repeating in all of these transformed shelters. One is the sitara. And sitara in Arabic means drapery or curtain. And also it can mean, and this concept is very specific to Middle Eastern culture, it means the in between space between the outside and the inside, the semi public space that it's like a vestibule. It serves as an entrance, but also to protect the privacy of the house. And that was one of the things that is added early on in each of these shelters. So you'd see it in the Palestinian camp, overspilling outside the demarcated area of shelters. In the younger Jerash camp, you'd see it as introverted inside the entrance, using blankets or fabric to create an in-between space. And the Zatari camp, which is the most poor, and it has very limited building materials. You would also see it with fabric and blankets. Also, there is the element of the haush, the courtyard, which is also an element found in traditional Middle Eastern architecture. Refugees make sure to create a semi-public space or a courtyard in the middle of the house to organize the different functions around it. Just like traditional Middle Eastern architecture. You'd see it more clearly in the newer camps because it's still bigger. The family didn't grow in numbers, so it's not as dense. So there is more room to create courtyards. And most times they're exposed, they're uncovered, or semi covered. In Zatari, however, because it's in the desert and it's very harsh environment, you'd still see that central space organizing the different functions of the dwelling, but it's covered loosely, but definitely covered. And then there is the hammam or the toilet space. So in humanitarian settlements, usually toilets are communal and they're shared. In Zatari, the planning of the camp, communal toilets were shared between 50 people. But as soon as that element starts getting inside the shelter, inside the dwelling, we can see that the shelter started to transform into a complex structure. So, in the older camps, most of the camps now have their private bathrooms and toilets, but in Zatari, it's still in that transitioning space. So I got to witness that, and refugees build their own toilets. And most of the time, it's unhygienic because it's self made. So there are around 4,000 private toilets in Zatari camp that do not comply with the minimum hygiene standards. And one of them is simply that there's not enough water to keep that toilet clean, because each household in Zatari consume 35 liters per day. That's in 2017, compared to 60 liter per day for each person in Jordan. So that that portion that used for sanitation, keeping that, it's usually not clean. And what I try to establish by exploring those elements that keep repeating and transform the simple shelters, temporary shelters, is that even though refugees suffer from geographic and physical disposition from their homeland, that doesn't imply social and cultural disposition. People carry their culture and the way they use the space and their tradition and their understanding of the space from their homeland to this in between space suspended in time and geography and politics. When refugee architecture starts to emerge, it imitates their understanding of their architecture. It's very specific to each culture. So when we saw early on those shelters being repeated in anywhere around the world, it's a recipe for failure. Each community has their own understanding that of architecture that shows later when they transform those shelters into domestic architecture, refugee domestic architecture. I'm going to briefly go through other themes I explored in my research, which I will be happy to answer you more if you have any questions about it later on. Other themes explored the patterns that emerge from the physical structure. And I did that by trying to explore the negative space and the positive space, and the relation to mass and void to geography. And with that, I found out that the shelter's transformation, whether it overspills in the oldest camps because it's the most dense, it's the highest population per area, um, or it transforms to the inside like Jerash Gaza camp, or the same temporary shelter starts to change shape and transform, it creates a very elastic um, urban fabric. This elasticity um, breaks down this orthogonal temporary humanitarian design solution for the camp. Also, I think with this elasticity, there is an autonomy for the community that claims back the space from the management and control of the humanitarian bodies as power structures in a refugee camp. Another theme I explored is the souk, or the marketplaces. In Arabic, marketplaces means souk. And the way to explain it, the simplest way to explain it is that just like when you look at an orange slice, you know that it came from a bigger entity, a bigger fruit, but you can only see the slides, but it indicates the presence of the whole fruit. With marketplaces, and especially in the Middle East, marketplaces are social spaces. It's a performative for ritual and culture of that um, community. Marketplaces mean that there is a city, that whole urban body, that whole one entity is there. So whenever we see a marketplace, we know that it's a complex urban body, just like the orange slice and the whole orange. So when we look at the souk, we know that there is a city camp and that there is a social production of space, and there is a genus loci, which means the spirit of the place. You know, when you visit a town and you know that there is something special, particular about it, it's called the genus Loci, according to Norbert Schultz. So, this complex urban body, we can explore it from exploring the souk, the marketplace that emerges from the transformation of certain shelters into shops, or the overspilling to the public space to create um, a market, like you see in the oldest refugee camps. Also, it was very interesting that when I was in the marketplaces, I would see wedding invitations as banners in the marketplace because it became the core um, social space for the community. Also, in this camp, for example, all the shops have steps that the community gathers and exchange, you know, talks, hellos, and you would find a courtesy chair in every on every platform for the old people in the community to sit and rest and chat. And even in Zatari, you would see, um, the marketplace is very colorful, communicative of the brand and the product, and the informal economy that emerges as well. So, to wrap up this very brief overview of a very complex research, how do displaced communities inside humanitarian planned settlements Jordan create architecture? I believe they create it on or the proof that I could see, it was on three levels: the domestic, the shelter organization, and the camp as an urban entity by diet placement. And what I mean by that is that even though those displaced communities are not related to the geography, they are inhibiting space, regardless of the temporary presence of the legal state of exception, of all the other circumstances. Communities inhibit a space and they create architecture, even without the services of a professional architect or a town planner. Um, these camps that were meant to be orthogonal, quick fix solutions, standardized, without an identity for the vulnerable refugee. That doesn't matter whether that refugee is in Africa or Asia or in the Middle East. These communities claim back the space by inhibiting it and creating architecture. So what what I want you to take is, regardless if you end up working in a humanitarian body or not, I would, I think, I would hope for architecture students to explore um, the autonomy of each culture to their spaces, and what architecture really means to the people. And instead of us as designers placing ourselves in a place of authority, maybe we can facilitate and explore other ways of designing to communities. Um, so that's the end of my lecture. The complete research will be available on QTE Prints. I would love to hear from you, your comments, your feedback, your questions. So please leave it in the comment section under this video. And thank you.